First off, I want to publicly thank Joey Katama for all his work in organizing a 24-hour adoration that we could pray, fast, offer our sacrifices for the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization bill that is currently pending with the Supreme Court. I've been meditating this past hour about abortion, about where we find ourselves as a nation at this time. And I've been told that I'm more someone who looks at the essence of things. I'm not as interested in the news of what's happening in the present moment, but what it says about who we are as human beings, how that's reflected in the gospel, and how that's been reflected in the history of humanity. That's what I'm really interested in, who we are as human beings in the midst of the different events that come about. So I looked up, first off, the true history of Moloch, the ancient god of child sacrifice. And I was really interested because this person from history books were just writing about this figure, Moloch, as an existential experience that people had in our history. It said, condemned by biblical prophets and Roman senators alike, few pagan deities were as reviled as Moloch, a god whose bronze body was a furnace used for sacrificing children. Child sacrifice is non-existent today, thankfully, but that hasn't always been the case. In ancient times, it was commonly associated with people hoping for greater fertility for either a person or the land. But one cult stands out from the rest, the cult of Moloch, the Canaanite god of child sacrifice. The cult of Moloch, who is also called Molech, is said to have boiled children alive in the bowels of a big bronze statue with the body of a man and the head of a bull. Offerings, at least according to the Hebrew Bible, were to be reaped through either fire or war, and devotees can still be found with them to this day. And so you can even see ancient paintings of this god Moloch, and it has its hands out, and they would basically heat up this iron statue as hot as it could go, and then people would come in hopes to having greater fertility, and which means greater money and success in this world. They would place their own children upon the hands of this idol and sacrifice their child, basically. And I found it interesting, this one man wrote an article calling it Our Modern Moloch, Child Sacrifice in the 21st Century, because this person writing that article had the audacity to say, thankfully, those things don't happen in our civilized country, in our civilized age. We've grown beyond that. We can look back at those people and say how horrendous it is. And yet, in the midst of this whole debate over shortening the available time for women to get abortions, this was put up in the New York Times, this slogan. This person said, "It's time for companies to stand up for reproductive health care. Restricting access to comprehensive reproductive care, including abortion, threatens the health, independence, and economic stability of our employees and customers. Simply put, it goes against our values and is bad for business." Restricting abortion is bad for business. Or phrased a bit more honestly, abortion is good for business. That was their argument in the New York Times. So you can ask the question, how much have we actually changed over the years? Or is it just because the fact that we don't actually see people publicly doing this, pridefully, at least not yet, that somehow we're protected from it? Right now, if you're not aware of the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Healthcare Organization, what's going on right now, it's a pending U.S. Supreme Court case, and I'm going to just kind of read off some details about this, just in case you haven't really been up on it. Dealing with the constitutionality of a 2018 Mississippi law state that banned abortion operations after the first 15 weeks of pregnancy. Lower courts ruled in preliminary injunctions to prevent enforcement of the law on the basis that the law violated the holding of women's rights in Roe versus Wade, which generally allows women to opt for abortion within the first 24 weeks. So basically, since Roe versus Wade, women could have abortions as late as 24 weeks. After that, there was another case that was brought up in 1992, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and at that point they were trying to lower it down to fetal viability. But they were able to sustain that time because they said, well, based on the ruling of Roe versus Wade, we can't change that. Recently, it was brought down to 15 weeks in Mississippi. So just by taking it down to 15 weeks sets a new precedent, which means that Roe versus Wade is not what we look to anymore to decide how we rule independent states govern their abortion laws. So basically, and that's trying to be overturned right now at the Supreme Court. And so if this law is upheld in Mississippi, what it means is that there's going to be a new turn in our laws in prohibiting abortion. It's just one step at a time. And it's for this reason that the Catholic bishops, many priests have been asked to pray and to fast for an end or even increased limit to abortion. But again, coming back to what does this say about us as human beings, that's what's more interesting to me. Because I'm really tired of always hearing that we've moved on, that somehow our human nature has evolved from the sin that we read and discover in the scriptures over and over again. And there's a quote, this could be very provocative, but it's from Father John Hart. He's one of my favorite Jesuit priests, and in honor of great Jesuits who came before me here, I figured I'd read a quote from another Jesuit on this very subject. Father John Hardin says, "The reason we have such massive slaughter of the innocents is because we have become a fornicating society, an adulterous society, a masturbating society, a homosexual society, and a contraceptive society. Unchaste people are selfish people. They will not stop at murder if an unborn child would be a burden to their indulgence and sexual pleasure." Let's just be honest about what this debate is really about. And it's about us as human beings trying to have as much sex with whoever we want without consequence. It's unchastity. And we don't realize that when we turn against God for ourselves, for our own pleasure, to do our own thing, to grasp that forbidden fruit, what follows as a consequence is what God warned us from the beginning. If you eat of that fruit, you will die. Death is always the consequence of breaking commandments. And that is why we have become such a murderous nation, especially against the most vulnerable of children. Because we have fallen into that same lie that our parents fell into in the Garden of Eden. God knows well that when you eat from that tree, you will become gods like him, knowing good from evil. You will get to decide for yourself what is right and what is wrong. And then you can find the fulfillment that you're longing for in this earth. That's always the perennial lie. Let us pray that we awaken to the reality of where we are as a nation, of the amount of babies that we could truly save and bring into this world, into a God of life, by the sustaining of this law. And pray especially for a deeper awareness of the rebellion that is in every one of our hearts. The rebellion against God that is growing only louder in our own country. To do what we want in order to get the utopian world that we desire in this life. And that we will go to no end of breaking the commandments of God to sustain. That's a real understanding of the fallenness of our human nature. And if we do not understand that, the consequences of that for us and for this nation will always be death.